Amina's life was one of quiet resilience. As a single mother, she dedicated herself entirely to her daughter, Valentina. Despite Valentina's physical disability, which required constant care and attention, Amina had managed to create a nurturing, supportive environment for her. Their home was filled with laughter and the sound of everyday life, small moments that kept them grounded in a world that often felt isolating. Valentina, though unable to walk on her own, had a bright spirit. She loved sitting outside, watching the birds, and feeling the sun on her face. Amina, always by her side, would push her daughter's wheelchair out into their small front yard, the one place where Valentina could feel independent, if only for a moment. The neighborhood, a serene suburban enclave, seemed to echo their peaceful existence. The houses were neatly manicured, and the lawns were meticulously maintained. Everything in the neighborhood was arranged according to a set of rigid rules dictated by the Homeowners Association, HOA. Amina had heard plenty of stories about the HOA's strict enforcement of these rules, but they hadn't affected her until now. The residents were a mix of people, some friendly, others less so, but everyone seemed to mind their own business. At least that's what Amina had believed. It was easy to assume that life could go on smoothly as long as you kept to yourself. But things started to shift after one seemingly innocent afternoon. It was a warm day, the kind of day when the air held just enough breeze to make sitting outside pleasant. Amina rolled Valentina's wheelchair to the small patch of grass in their front yard. Valentina beamed, her face lighting up as the sun touched her skin. Amina set up her own chair beside her daughter, content to just enjoy the moment. They didn't need anything else, just the quiet, the fresh air, and each other. Amina knew she had a lot to be grateful for, but her life wasn't without its worries. Raising a child with a disability meant constant appointments, endless worry, and a deep unspoken fear about how Valentina would navigate the world. But in this moment, all those concerns faded, replaced by the simple joy of being together. As the hours passed, Amina and Valentina shared stories, talked about their favorite books, and laughed together. It was an idyllic afternoon, and for a while it felt like nothing could ruin their peace. That was until Karen came into the picture. Karen was one of their neighbors, an older woman with a sharp tongue and a penchant for making unsolicited comments. Amina had always been polite when interacting with her, but there was something about Karen that didn't sit right. She had a way of looking at things that made Amina uneasy. Perhaps it was the way she carried herself, always a little too concerned about what other people were doing, or maybe it was the constant judgment she seemed to pass on others, as though their lives were somehow in need of correction. On that particular day, as Amina and Valentina were enjoying their time outside, Karen approached. She walked across the street with purpose, her eyes narrowing slightly as she drew closer. Amina wasn't surprised, as Karen often found reasons to strike up conversations, but there was something in her manner today that felt different, almost deliberate. As Karen reached them, she gave a curt nod to Amina before turning her gaze to Valentina. "Well, I see you're making yourself at home," Karen said, her tone dripping with a passive-aggressive sweetness. "Not exactly the best place to park that thing, is it? The HOA's been getting a lot of complaints about people using their lawns for things other than, well, lawns. We like to keep things neat around here." Amina's smile faltered. She had heard about Karen's tendencies to judge, but this felt more personal. She glanced at Valentina, whose face was still beaming, oblivious to the sharpness of Karen's words. Amina's protective instincts flared, and she could feel her chest tightening. "She's just sitting outside," Amina replied carefully, trying to keep the conversation civil. "It's her favorite place to be." Karen's lips tightened into a thin, disapproving line. "Well, it's not exactly what I'd call respectful to the rest of us. Maybe you should think about moving her further into your yard, away from the grass." "Just a suggestion, of course," Karen said, her voice laced with a false sweetness that made Amina's skin crawl. Amina forced herself to smile, but the unease in her stomach couldn't be ignored. "Thank you for the suggestion, Karen," she said, her voice steady, though she felt a pang of frustration. "We're just enjoying the afternoon." Karen nodded curtly, giving Valentina one last pointed look before turning and walking away. As she retreated, Amina couldn't help but feel a chill in the air. What was it about Karen's words that felt so calculated, so insidious? Amina had heard rumors about her before. How Karen had gotten into it with other neighbors, how she had no tolerance for anything that didn't fit her rigid view of the world. But Amina had always shrugged it off, assuming it didn't concern her. Now, for the first time, she felt a deep sense of foreboding. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze of quiet tension. Amina tried to push the encounter out of her mind, but Karen's words lingered in the back of her thoughts. Was this just an isolated incident, or was there more to it? Amina couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something bigger, something that would soon threaten the peace she had fought so hard to build. The calm before the storm had already arrived, and Amina had no idea how much more it would cost her to protect the one thing she loved most, her daughter. The days following the incident with Karen felt strangely different to Amina. The unease that had begun to creep in slowly intensified, like the dull hum of an impending storm. She tried to focus on the usual routines of life, caring for Valentina, making sure the house was tidy, preparing meals, and attending doctor appointments. Yet, no matter how much she tried to distract herself, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to break. Each time she stepped outside, her eyes instinctively searched for Karen, her sharp gaze always watching from behind the curtains or from across the street. It was as though Karen was waiting for an opportunity to strike. Amina's heart sank every time she rolled Valentina's wheelchair into the yard. The once peaceful space had transformed into something more tense, something more fraught with the weight of invisible eyes watching their every move. It wasn't just Karen's hostility, it was the quiet undercurrent of judgment from others in the neighborhood. As the days wore on, the other residents began to make their own subtle remarks, either in passing or behind the safety of their closed doors. No one was overtly aggressive, but the whispered glances, the casual comments about rules and property rights, all pointed back to the same source, Karen. It felt like a quiet war had been waged against them, and Amina was fighting a battle she hadn't even realized had begun. One afternoon, Amina received a letter in the mail from the HOA. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it, a sick feeling creeping up her spine. The letter was short, direct, and almost curt in its tone. It referenced a complaint that had been filed against her for unauthorized use of common property, in other words, Valentina sitting on the lawn. The letter stated that, as per the community guidelines, sitting or lounging on the lawn was prohibited unless it was for specific HOA-approved purposes, such as scheduled neighborhood events or community picnics. Amina's blood ran cold. She had never felt more targeted in her life. At first, she couldn't believe it. Was this really happening? Was her daughter, who simply wanted to enjoy a moment of sunlight, being penalized for the crime of existing in a place she was entitled to be? Amina knew that Karen had always been vocal about following the rules, but to take it this far, to involve the HOA, and to use her position to undermine a mother's simple desire to provide her daughter with a sense of normalcy, this was something entirely new. The letter didn't leave much room for negotiation. It gave her an ultimatum to move Valentina's chair or face a fine. Amina was seething. She had read the letter 3 times, each time hoping she had missed something. But it was clear the HOA, with its bureaucratic coldness, had taken Karen's complaint seriously. The letter seemed to imply that the HOA would only take further action if the issue escalated, but Amina couldn't help but feel that they were already lining up against her. She tried to reach out to the HOA for clarification, but every call was met with a dismissive response. They refused to intervene, claiming that this was a private matter between neighbors and that they couldn't take sides. Amina sat in her kitchen later that evening, staring at the letter, her hands trembling. How could something so trivial be allowed to spiral into such a painful ordeal? She looked across the room to where Valentina sat, content as ever, her small smile lighting up the room. It broke Amina's heart to think that her daughter, who had fought so hard to live a normal life, was now being punished for doing something so simple, sitting outside and enjoying a peaceful moment. Amina confided in her husband, Faisal, that evening, sharing the letter and expressing her anger and confusion. Faisal listened patiently, though Amina could tell he, too, was deeply upset. He understood the gravity of the situation, but suggested they take a more measured approach. He didn't want to make an enemy of the entire neighborhood, but Amina's frustration couldn't be quelled. She had been through so much to protect Valentina, and now this? It felt like a violation, a slap in the face. She couldn't let it slide. Not when Valentina's well-being was on the line. Over the next few days, the tension only grew. Every time Amina stepped outside with Valentina, she felt the weight of invisible eyes on her. The neighbors no longer greeted her with the same warmth. There were no more casual conversations or smiles exchanged in passing. It was as though the entire street had taken Karen's side without question. No one said anything directly, but the distance, the avoidance, it was palpable. Amina found herself asking, why were they so quick to believe Karen's word over hers? She was the one who had to live with the consequences of her daughter's disability. She was the one who had to shoulder the burden of raising Valentina in a world that didn't always understand her. Why was she being punished for simply trying to give her daughter a sense of normalcy? Then came another encounter with Karen. Amina had hoped to avoid her, but there was no escaping her now. Karen had walked up to Amina's driveway, her expression stern. She didn't even acknowledge Valentina, who was sitting in her wheelchair beside Amina. Instead, she went straight into her complaint. "I've been getting more complaints about you," Karen said, her voice clipped. "You're not taking this seriously. The HOA is going to have to take further action if you don't move that chair. It's not fair to the rest of us." Amina's heart raced as she fought to keep her voice steady. Valentina has every right to sit outside like everyone else. This is her home, too. Karen's eyes flashed with irritation. "Rules are rules," she snapped, "and if you don't want to face consequences, you'll need to follow them." The conversation ended there, but the message was clear. Karen wasn't going to stop. And now, Amina knew that neither could she. The war had been declared, but Amina wasn't ready to back down. She would fight for her daughter, even if it meant taking on the entire neighborhood. The tension was growing, and the battle was only beginning. Amina's world had shifted irreparably in just a few short days. The tension, which had begun as a simmering undercurrent, was now an overwhelming force that consumed every moment of her life. Each glance at the front lawn made her stomach turn. Every time she opened her door, there was an invisible weight that she could no longer ignore. She had tried to keep it together for Valentina's sake, her sweet, innocent daughter who had done nothing wrong, but the constant pressure, the judgment from the HOA and Karen, was wearing her down. Amina had hoped it would pass, that it would all blow over. But the more she tried to ignore it, the more it festered until it reached a boiling point. One afternoon, after yet another complaint from Karen, this time with a more aggressive tone in the letter, Amina had had enough. The idea of staying silent and complying with the HOA's unjust rules felt like betrayal. She had spent too many years fighting for Valentina's rights to let some petty HOA regulations take away the small freedoms she had fought so hard for. Valentina deserved the right to sit in her own front yard. This wasn't just about a lawn. It was about a mother protecting her daughter, about standing up for something that was right. The day Karen's letter arrived, Amina's frustration exploded. The letter demanded that she remove Valentina from the front yard immediately or face a hefty fine. The final line in the letter felt like a slap in the face. "This will be your final warning." Amina knew it was the HOA's final attempt to break her, to make her bend to their will, and to enforce Karen's personal vendetta. She had spent days stewing in anger, but now her resolve was solidifying. The thought of backing down, of giving in to Karen's cruelty, was unbearable. That afternoon, as she pushed Valentina's wheelchair out onto the front lawn, Amina made up her mind. This would not be the end. This was just the beginning of a new fight. But Amina wasn't naive. She knew that standing up to Karen and the HOA would come with consequences. The repercussions were still unclear, but she knew they would be significant. Despite this, the fear that had once paralyzed her began to dissipate, replaced by a fierce determination to protect her daughter's right to live without fear. As she wheeled Valentina across the yard, Karen's shadow loomed in the distance. Amina could already feel the tension in the air, thick with expectation. It was the same feeling she had gotten every time she'd crossed paths with Karen since that first altercation, like something was about to snap. And today, Amina knew would be the day. Karen's footsteps approached, slow and deliberate. Amina braced herself, watching as Karen crossed the street with that same sharp, calculating expression. She wasn't walking over to make small talk. No, today was different. Today, Karen had something else in mind. Amina could see it in her eyes. Are you really that stubborn? Karen's voice was low, dripping with condescension. You think you can just do whatever you want with no regard for the community? Amina's heart pounded, but she didn't flinch. I'm not doing anything wrong. Valentina deserves to sit outside just like anyone else. Karen scoffed, shaking her head as if Amina were being unreasonable. This isn't about your daughter. It's about respect for the rules. You can't just ignore the community standards because you don't like them. Amina's grip tightened on Valentina's chair, her anger rising. You don't care about the rules. You care about making everyone else miserable, Karen, and I'm not going to let you use those rules to hurt my daughter. The words were out before she could stop them, but she knew they were the truth. It wasn't about rules. It was about control. It was about Karen finding a way to exercise power over those she saw as weak. And in this moment, Amina wasn't going to let Karen win. She wasn't going to let her intimidate them any longer. You don't understand, Karen said, her voice taking on a dangerous edge. The HOA won't tolerate this any longer. If you don't comply, you'll regret it. I'll make sure of it. Amina didn't back down. She met Karen's gaze head-on, refusing to let her fear show. You can't intimidate me anymore, Karen. This is my home, and I will fight for my daughter. The air between them crackled with tension, the silence deafening as Karen stared at Amina as if sizing her up. Then, with a final venomous glare, Karen turned and walked away. Amina exhaled slowly, her heart racing. She knew it wasn't over. She knew Karen wouldn't let it go, and the HOA was bound to back her up. But for the first time in a long while, Amina felt something that she hadn't felt in days. Hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, she could win this fight. That night, as Amina sat beside Valentina's bed, she realized that this was more than just a battle against Karen or the HOA. It was a fight for her dignity, for her daughter's right to exist in a world that often didn't have room for people like her. It was a fight for every mother who had ever felt powerless, for every child who had been made to feel small. And Amina knew, without a doubt, that she was willing to do whatever it took to win. The next steps were unclear, but one thing was certain: Amina was no longer going to let fear control her. She would stand tall for herself, for Valentina, and for the right to live without apology. It was time to take the fight to the HOA, and this time, she would not back down. It was supposed to be just another afternoon, another peaceful day in Amina's small corner of the world. The sun was warm, and Valentina sat happily on the front lawn in her wheelchair. As usual, her face bathed in sunlight. Amina had set up a small table next to her, a cup of tea in hand as she sat beside her daughter. Life had settled into a routine, one that felt like normalcy, despite the mounting tension from Karen and the HOA. Amina had been expecting some sort of confrontation, but she wasn't prepared for what happened next. The sound of footsteps, quick and deliberate, broke the gentle atmosphere. Amina looked up and saw Karen marching across the street, her expression cold and determined, her lips pressed tightly together. The familiar sense of dread washed over Amina. But this time, there was something in Karen's stance that made Amina's heart race, a sense of purpose, something beyond a simple complaint. Are you still sitting here? Karen's voice rang out as she approached, her tone sharp and filled with disdain. She didn't even acknowledge Valentina, who was looking up at her with wide eyes, unaware of the hostility in the air. Amina's stomach twisted, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I'm not breaking any rules," Amina replied, keeping her voice steady. "Valentina has every right to be here." Karen didn't even look at Amina when she responded. Instead, she stepped closer to the lawn and, in a swift motion, pulled out a large bucket from behind her. Amina froze, her instinct screaming that something wasn't right. The bucket was filled with hot wax, the kind Karen had mentioned before, wax she had been using for her candle-making hobby. Before Amina could react, Karen's hands tipped the bucket, and the hot wax spilled out, cascading down onto Valentina's legs. The sizzling sound was immediately followed by Valentina's piercing scream, a sound that cut through the air like a knife. Amina rushed forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to pull Valentina away, but the wax had already melted into her skin. Valentina's cries were agonizing, her body stiffening with pain as Amina frantically reached for a towel to try and cool the burn. "Karen!" Amina shouted, her voice raw with panic and anger. "What have you done?" Karen stood there, watching impassively, her cold eyes betraying no emotion. "She shouldn't be on my lawn," she said, as if it was the simplest explanation in the world. "She's a nuisance." Amina felt a surge of fury, so intense that it almost made her dizzy. She cradled Valentina in her arms, her mind reeling. You spilled hot wax on my daughter." Amina's voice broke as she looked at the angry red burns on Valentina's legs, the pain evident in her daughter's face. "You've made your point, Karen," Amina said, her voice shaking with rage. "Now leave." But Karen didn't leave. She stood there, watching, almost as if she was waiting for something. Amina could feel the heat of the wax still on her daughter's skin, the burning sensation that seemed to taunt her, reminding her of the cruelty she had just witnessed. With a force that Amina hadn't known she was capable of, she stood up, her body trembling with both fury and fear. "Get off my property," she spat at Karen, "and don't come back." But Karen didn't respond. She simply turned and walked away, her steps slow and deliberate, as if she had already won. Amina stood there, watching her retreating figure, her heart still racing. In that moment, Amina felt a deep, gut-wrenching realization. This wasn't just about a lawn. This wasn't just about Valentina sitting outside. This was about something much darker, a woman who had been pushed too far, a mother who had been pushed to the edge. Amina didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear. Karen had just crossed the line, and Amina would never let her get away with it. Amina cradled Valentina in her arms, feeling the warmth of her daughter's tears on her skin. The pain on Valentina's face was almost too much to bear. She had been burned by more than just the wax. She had been burned by cruelty, by someone who had no regard for the suffering she caused. The car ride to the hospital felt like an eternity. Amina drove with trembling hands, her eyes focused on the road, but her thoughts were a whirlwind of anger and desperation. She kept glancing at Valentina, who was trying to hold back tears. The silence in the car was deafening, the weight of the moment heavy in the air. When they arrived at the hospital, the doctors immediately took charge, assessing the severity of the burns. Amina couldn't look away from Valentina's legs, the skin already starting to blister and redden. She wanted to scream, to lash out, but instead, she remained by Valentina's side, her mind racing. The doctors treated Valentina's wounds as best as they could, applying ointments and bandages to soothe the burns. They assured Amina that Valentina would recover, but the scars, physical and emotional, would take time to heal. As the hours dragged on in the hospital, Amina's thoughts remained focused on one thing. How could someone be so cruel? How could someone hurt a helpless child just because they didn't like her sitting on their lawn? The answer came slowly, but with sharp clarity. It wasn't about a lawn. It wasn't even about the rules. It was about control, about someone who believed they had the right to dictate who could exist in a space and who couldn't. Karen had crossed a line, and Amina knew that things would never be the same again. She had always fought for Valentina, But now, the fight had become something bigger, a fight for justice, a fight for respect, and a fight for the right to live freely without fear. The wax had burned Valentina's skin, but it had also burned away the last remnants of Amina's silence. She would fight this, not just for Valentina, but for everyone who had ever felt small, for everyone who had been made to feel that they didn't belong. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The hospital room was quiet except for the faint sound of the machines monitoring Valentina's condition. Amina sat beside her daughter, her hand gently resting on Valentina's. The pain from the burn was evident in the way Valentina shifted in her sleep, but there was more than just physical pain. Amina knew that the emotional scars would take longer to heal than the physical ones. This wasn't just an assault on her daughter, it was an assault on everything they had built together, their peace, their safety, their sense of belonging. As Amina sat there, her mind raced. The world around her seemed to move in slow motion. Karen's actions had been calculated and cold, but they weren't isolated. Amina began to realize that Karen had been a thorn in the side of the neighborhood for a long time. It wasn't just the lawn. This wasn't about some misguided attempt to protect the rules of a community, it was about power. It was about control. And Karen had used the HOA to keep everyone in check, to impose her own brand of order. Amina knew she needed to do more than just file a complaint with the HOA. She needed evidence. She needed something solid that would back up her claims, not just for Karen's actions, but to show the HOA that they had allowed this situation to fester, that they had ignored the warning signs. The first step was to gather information. Amina reached out to the neighbors who had been silent observers of Karen's behavior, hoping that someone might be willing to speak up. She had a few conversations with the more distant neighbors, but they were all too scared to get involved. The HOA was notorious for its strict enforcement of rules, and no one wanted to risk Karen's wrath. Amina couldn't blame them. It wasn't easy to go against someone so entrenched in the community. But Amina refused to let this slide. She decided to dig deeper. Over the next few days, she took it upon herself to do some research. She spent hours on the internet searching for any hint of a pattern in Karen's behavior. And it didn't take long for her to uncover a troubling truth. Karen had a history of being overly aggressive toward anyone she deemed as a problem. There were several past incidents, all documented by neighbors who had received fines or warnings from the HOA because of Karen's complaints. It wasn't just about the lawn, it was about her belief that she had the right to enforce her own version of what was acceptable in the neighborhood. Amina also learned about Karen's involvement with the HOA, and it became clear that Karen wasn't just an ordinary neighbor, she had influence. She had been serving on the HOA board for years, and in that time, she had quietly manipulated the system to serve her own interests. The HOA's willingness to back her up, despite her actions, became even more evident. They didn't question her. They didn't challenge her. And in some cases, they even rewarded her for her loyalty to the organization. The more Amina uncovered, the angrier she became. This wasn't just an isolated incident, it was part of a much bigger problem. The HOA, instead of protecting the residents, was enabling a toxic environment where people like Karen could get away with their cruelty. And the worst part was they had turned a blind eye to the pain and suffering she had caused. Amina knew this wasn't just about Valentina's burns anymore. It was about holding people accountable, about shining a light on the corruption that had allowed this to go on unchecked for so long. Determined to make a difference, Amina began documenting everything. She took pictures of the burns on Valentina's legs, capturing the evidence of the hot wax that had melted into her skin. She collected the letters and complaints from the HOA, noting the way they had failed to intervene when Karen's behavior escalated. Amina also took screenshots of Karen's past complaints and emails that she had sent to the HOA, showing how she had used her position to manipulate the situation. She kept a journal of every conversation she had with the neighbors, noting down their fears and reluctance to speak up. It wasn't easy. Amina knew that every step she took in exposing Karen and the HOA would lead to more backlash. But she didn't care. The more she uncovered, the clearer it became that she couldn't let this go. She had to make it right. Valentina deserved better, and the entire neighborhood deserved better. In the midst of all this, Amina also turned to legal advice. She contacted a lawyer who specialized in civil cases and harassment. She explained the situation, and the lawyer's response was exactly what Amina had hoped for. This was a case that could be taken to court. But Amina also knew that legal battles were long and exhausting, especially when dealing with an organization like the HOA, which had the resources to fight back. Still, the lawyer assured her that they had a strong case, especially now that they had concrete evidence. Amina also began to gather support from other residents who had been silently enduring the same treatment from Karen. While most of them were reluctant to get involved, a few brave neighbors came forward, willing to testify about Karen's behavior and her undue influence on the HOA. Amina knew that together they could make a real change. It wasn't just about Valentina anymore. It was about taking down a bully who had abused her power for too long. As the investigation unfolded, Amina felt a shift within herself. She had always been strong, but now she was fighting with a new kind of strength, a strength born from the knowledge that she wasn't alone. She had the truth on her side, and she was willing to go as far as it took to make sure Karen paid for what she had done. The battle was far from over, but Amina had no intention of backing down. She would expose Karen for what she truly was, and she would bring the HOA's complacency to light. This fight for Valentina's dignity and for the truth was just beginning. As the investigation into Karen's actions gained momentum, Amina's resolve solidified. The evidence was undeniable. Karen's cruelty, the HOA's complicity, and the impact it all had on Valentina. But despite the mounting proof, Amina knew the hardest part was yet to come. The community, which had long been passive and afraid of Karen's influence, would be reluctant to stand against her. The HOA had been playing favorites for far too long, and Amina knew that taking on Karen and the HOA meant she would face not just legal battles, but a fierce, uphill struggle against a deeply entrenched system of power and control. But as the days passed, Amina grew more determined. She spent hours at her computer, pulling together everything she had uncovered. She reached out to more neighbors, determined to find anyone who would stand with her. She wasn't sure how much longer she could handle the weight of the situation on her own. The pain from Valentina's burns was starting to fade physically, but the emotional scars were still raw. Amina wanted justice for Valentina and for everyone who had been mistreated by Karen or the HOA. Then, one evening, Amina received a phone call that would change everything. It was from one of the neighbors, someone she had barely spoken to before. "I've been watching things unfold," the voice on the other end said, "and I can't stand by any longer. I know you're not the only one Karen's targeted. There's more, lots more. I'm willing to talk." Amina's heart raced. This was the breakthrough she had been hoping for. The neighbor's name was Linda, and she had lived in the neighborhood for years. Linda confessed that she had witnessed Karen's behavior toward other residents for a long time. Karen had made complaints about people's lawns, their pets, their property lines, all in an effort to control the neighborhood and exert her dominance. She even had a hand in making sure certain families were fined for minor infractions that had been ignored when committed by others. Linda wasn't the only one who had been too afraid to speak up, but now that Amina had opened the door, Linda was ready to step forward and expose the truth. Amina's thoughts raced. This was the chance she had been waiting for, the chance to rally the neighbors who had suffered in silence. Linda wasn't the only one willing to talk. Slowly, more and more residents began reaching out to Amina. Some had endured Karen's petty demands, while others had been threatened by the HOA for standing up to her. It was clear now that Karen's reign of terror wasn't just isolated to Amina's family. It was part of a much larger pattern of intimidation and manipulation. But the more Amina learned, the more concerned she became. Linda wasn't the first person to come forward, others had, too. But each time the stories were similar. Karen had become so deeply embedded in the HOA's inner workings that it was almost impossible to challenge her without fear of retaliation. The HOA had allowed Karen to operate unchecked, dismissing complaints and protecting her from any repercussions. In fact, Amina learned that Karen had been in charge of enforcing the HOA's community guidelines for years, giving her not only influence over the neighborhood, but also the power to control how complaints were handled. That meant every time someone challenged her, they were silenced, either through intimidation or bureaucratic loopholes. Amina felt a cold knot of fear settle in her stomach. The more she learned, the more she realized that Karen's power wasn't just in her ability to manipulate the HOA, it was in her connections, her ability to twist the system in her favor. Amina could already feel the weight of what she was about to face. If she wanted to take this any further, she would need more than just a few voices willing to speak out. She would need a united front, a movement of neighbors who were no longer afraid of the consequences. But even then, the odds seemed overwhelmingly stacked against her. The possibility of retaliation was real. Karen had made sure that the HOA had her back, and the HOA wasn't likely to turn on one of their own. Amina didn't just have to worry about fighting Karen, she had to worry about the entire system. If she pushed too hard, it could mean further harm for Valentina and her family. But the thought of letting this go, of allowing Karen to continue to inflict pain on others, was something Amina couldn't accept. Amina knew it was time to go public. She couldn't rely solely on legal measures anymore. She needed the community to see Karen for who she really was. But the risks were high. What if Karen came after them more aggressively? What if the HOA sided with her completely, turning the entire neighborhood against Amina and Valentina? There was no turning back now. Amina knew that if she was going to win this fight, she had to take the most daring step of all. She had to expose Karen and the HOA to the public, to lay bare the corruption and abuse that had been allowed to flourish for so long. But she wasn't alone anymore. Linda and the others had come forward, and with their support, Amina felt a new strength rising within her. She would no longer fight this battle in the shadows. This was her time to stand up, not just for Valentina, but for every family that had suffered under the weight of the HOA's unjust system. The truth was on her side, and now she was going to make sure the world saw it. Amina began drafting an email to the local news outlets, laying out the entire story, the harassment, the cover-ups, the personal vendettas, and the emotional toll that it had all taken. She included evidence, personal stories from neighbors, and her own account of what had happened. It was time to tell the world what Karen and the HOA had been doing in secret. Amina wasn't sure what would happen after that, whether Karen would retaliate, whether the HOA would try to silence her, or whether the truth would finally come to light. But she was prepared to face whatever came next. The battle had just begun, and Amina was ready for whatever it would take to win. The email was sent. Amina felt the weight of her decision the moment she hit send. It wasn't just an email. It was a declaration of war. By going public, she had opened a door that could never be closed. But there was no other choice. The pressure, the fear, and the growing injustice had pushed her to this point. She wasn't fighting just for her daughter anymore. She was fighting for every neighbor who had been too afraid to speak out, for every resident who had suffered in silence, intimidated by Karen and the HOA. The local news outlet responded almost immediately, requesting an interview. They were interested in the story, interested in the corruption, the abuse of power, and the horrific incident that had led to this point. Amina prepared herself for what was to come, knowing full well that the battle would now shift to the public arena. The day of the interview, Amina arrived at the news station with a mix of nerves and determination. She had gathered her evidence, the pictures of Valentina's burns, the records of the HOA's complaints, the testimonies of neighbors who were now willing to stand with her. She couldn't help but feel a small surge of hope. She was no longer alone in this fight, but she also knew the risks. Karen would likely not take this lying down, and the HOA would almost certainly fight back, trying to discredit her or dismiss her claims. But Amina couldn't be swayed. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of control, a sense that she was finally fighting on her own terms. The interview was intense. Amina explained everything from the hot wax incident to the history of Karen's complaints to the role of the HOA in enabling her behavior. She spoke about Valentina's suffering, not just physically but emotionally, how her daughter had been traumatized by Karen's cruelty. She told the story of a neighborhood, of how fear and silence had allowed Karen's power to grow unchecked. As Amina spoke, she could feel the weight of her words. This was the truth that had been buried for so long, and it was finally coming to light. The reporter asked hard questions, but Amina answered each one with unwavering clarity. She knew the importance of what she was doing. She wasn't just telling her story, she was telling the story of everyone who had been mistreated, everyone who had lived in fear of Karen's wrath. When the interview ended, Amina felt exhausted but triumphant. The story would be aired that evening, and she knew it would reach the ears of the community and beyond. It was a risk, a huge one, but it was the only way to bring about change. And Amina wasn't backing down now. The response from the community was swift. Neighbors who had once been silent began to speak out. People who had been too afraid to confront Karen or the HOA suddenly found their voices. The news broadcasted the story, showing Amina's interview, the pictures of Valentina's burns, and the testimonials of neighbors who were now willing to stand by her. The backlash against Karen and the HOA was immediate. Some residents were angry at the HOA's negligence, while others expressed shock at Karen's behavior. Social media exploded with comments, with many calling for an investigation into the HOA and Karen's role in manipulating the rules for her personal benefit. But it wasn't all positive. Karen, furious and humiliated, made her own statement. She called the news report one-sided and accused Amina of distorting the facts. She claimed that Valentina had been disrupting the neighborhood and that the HOA had simply been trying to enforce rules. Karen's statement was filled with bitterness and deflection, but it only fueled the fire. It was clear that Karen would stop at nothing to maintain her power, and now Amina was more certain than ever that she had to see this through to the end. The HOA, too, issued a statement, but it was carefully worded, vague, and defensive. They claimed they were investigating the matter and would take appropriate action. Amina knew that this was just their way of trying to save face. They had stood by Karen for too long, and now that the public was demanding accountability, they had no choice but to pretend to act. Amina had no intention of letting them sweep this under the rug. She was in the fight of her life, and she was ready for whatever came next. The weeks that followed were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and back-and-forth exchanges with the HOA, the lawyer, and the media. The investigation into the HOA's actions began to gain traction, and Amina could see that the community was starting to turn against Karen and the board members who had supported her. More neighbors came forward, sharing their own stories of harassment and intimidation. The pressure was mounting on the HOA to take action, but Amina knew they were going to fight tooth and nail to protect their own interests. Karen, meanwhile, grew more desperate. She had always been the one in control, the one who dictated the terms of the neighborhood. But now she was being forced to confront the consequences of her actions, and she didn't know how to handle it. Her previously polished, authoritative persona was starting to crack under the pressure. The community's trust in her had evaporated, and she knew her days of controlling the neighborhood were numbered. Amina, however, was focused. She wasn't going to let the distractions, the threats, or the delays keep her from her goal. She knew this was bigger than just her and Valentina. It was about holding people accountable, about standing up to a system that had allowed corruption and cruelty to thrive unchecked. She had become a symbol for everyone who had ever felt powerless, for everyone who had been intimidated into silence. As the confrontation between Amina and Karen escalated, so did the stakes. Amina knew that this battle was far from over. The HOA would continue to fight, Karen would continue to spread lies, but Amina had the truth on her side, and that was a weapon she would wield with everything she had. The stage was set for the final showdown. The truth would come out, and justice would prevail. But the question remained, how much would Amina be willing to sacrifice to make sure it happened? The pressure had been building for weeks, and now it was reaching its breaking point. Amina had already exposed Karen's actions to the media, rallied support from the neighbors, and even forced the HOA into a defensive position. But Karen, with all her resources and influence, wasn't going to let it end quietly. The stakes had never been higher. As the investigation into Karen's behavior gained traction, Amina found herself facing more threats and attempts at intimidation. Karen's wrath was far from over, and the HOA's refusal to take real action had only emboldened her. But Amina wasn't backing down. She knew this was the moment where the truth would either prevail or the system would silence her. The community was watching. The neighborhood, once divided, was now beginning to unite behind Amina's cause. More and more residents who had kept quiet out of fear were now speaking out, some going so far as to publicly denounce Karen and her manipulation of the HOA. It was a turning tide, but it wasn't without its risks. Karen, desperate to maintain her control, escalated her efforts. She went on the offensive, accusing Amina of slander, threatening legal action, and even attempting to turn public opinion against her with a smear campaign. But Amina knew her own truth was stronger than Karen's lies. The evidence was irrefutable: the hot wax incident, the recorded complaints, the testimonies of the neighbors who had suffered in silence for so long. Karen couldn't hide the truth any longer. The final confrontation came when the HOA, under intense public pressure, finally agreed to hold a meeting. The tension in the room was palpable as Amina, her lawyer, and several residents prepared to present their case. The HOA had no choice but to open the meeting to public scrutiny, though they still tried to control the narrative. Amina and her supporters, however, were ready. This was their moment. When the meeting began, it was clear that the HOA had no intention of admitting fault. They continued to defend Karen, speaking about her long-standing contributions to the community and downplaying the seriousness of her actions. But Amina stood up and addressed the room, her voice unwavering and full of conviction. For years, Karen has used her position to control and intimidate us, Amina said, her voice ringing through the room. She's manipulated the system, silenced those who have spoken out, and caused pain to families who just want to live peacefully. This isn't just about one incident. It's about a pattern of abuse and neglect that has been allowed to flourish under your watch. The room fell silent. Karen, sitting at the front, glared at Amina with a mixture of disbelief and contempt. She tried to speak, but Amina raised her hand, silencing her. "You no longer have control over this community," Amina continued, "and neither does the HOA if it continues to allow people like Karen to use power for personal gain." With the residents backing her up, Amina presented the evidence. Photos of the burns on Valentina's legs, the letters from the HOA dismissing her complaints, and the testimonies from other neighbors who had been victimized by Karen's ruthless tactics. Each piece of evidence added weight to her argument. By the time she finished, the room was filled with a mixture of shock and anger. The HOA could no longer deny the truth. For the first time, the members of the HOA seemed unsure of their position. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, realizing they had been complicit in allowing Karen's reign of terror to continue. One board member, after hearing the overwhelming evidence, even spoke up, suggesting that the HOA reconsider its relationship with Karen and look into reforms that would prevent future abuse. But Karen wasn't ready to accept defeat. She stood up, her voice shaking with rage. "This is ridiculous," she shouted. "You've all been manipulated by Amina's lies. She's trying to tear this community apart." But Amina, undeterred, continued to stand her ground. "No, Karen. You've torn this community apart with your lies, your manipulation, and your cruelty. But today it ends." The room erupted into murmurs as the board members deliberated in private. Amina held her breath, hoping that this meeting would lead to the justice she had been fighting for. After what felt like an eternity, the HOA returned with their decision. The outcome was a victory for Amina. The HOA, after hearing the compelling evidence, voted to expel Karen from the board and issue a formal apology to Amina and the other affected residents. They promised to review their policies and ensure that no other resident would be harassed or victimized in the same way. Karen's influence was broken and her hold over the community shattered. But even in defeat, Karen remained defiant. She stormed out of the meeting, vowing to get back at those who had opposed her. Amina knew this wouldn't be the last time she saw Karen's face, but for now, the victory was hers. She had not only won justice for Valentina, but had also exposed the corruption within the HOA and freed the community from the fear that had plagued it for so long. In the days that followed, Amina received messages of support from neighbors, friends, and even strangers who had been following the story. The sense of relief in the community was palpable. Amina's victory was a testament to the power of speaking out, to the strength of standing up for what was right, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. As Amina stood in front of her home, looking at Valentina, who was once again sitting peacefully on the front lawn, she felt a deep sense of pride. They had won. It had been a long and difficult fight, but they had made it through. The battle had taken its toll on Amina, emotionally, physically, and mentally, but she had emerged stronger. And more importantly, she had given Valentina something that no one could take away: a voice, a place to be, and the right to exist without fear. The storm had passed, but Amina knew that the fight for justice was never truly over. As long as there were people like Karen in the world, there would always be battles to fight. But Amina was ready for whatever came next, because now she knew that no matter what, she would never stop fighting for her daughter and for the truth. In the days following the HOA's decision, the weight of the battle began to lift. Amina could breathe again, but it wasn't the end she had expected. The victory, though hard-won, felt bittersweet. As she looked at her daughter, who was now recovering from the burns, the reality of everything they had been through settled in. The scars on Valentina's legs would heal, but the emotional scars would take longer on both of them. The trauma, the fear, the pain of being targeted for something so trivial, it all lingered in the quiet moments, the ones that no one could see. Amina found herself reflecting on the journey. The sleepless nights, the phone calls, the legal battles, and the endless uncertainty. It had been a fight that tested every ounce of her strength. She had feared for her daughter's safety, for her family's well-being, and for her own ability to stand tall in the face of a system that seemed so stacked against her. But now, with Karen expelled from the HOA and the community beginning to heal, Amina felt a deep sense of accomplishment. She had done what she set out to do. She had fought for justice for Valentina and for the people who had been too afraid to speak up. But the most important lesson Amina took from the experience wasn't just about the fight itself. It was about the power of community. The moment the neighbors began to speak out, to stand with her, she realized how much power they all had when they united. Alone, they had been vulnerable. But together, they had taken down an oppressive force and made their neighborhood a safer, more welcoming place. The power of one voice, of one mother, had ignited a fire that no one could put out. In the aftermath, Amina found herself reconnecting with the community in ways she hadn't before. Neighbors who had kept their distance were now reaching out, offering support and apologizing for their silence during the worst of it. The shame of having turned a blind eye to Karen's behavior was palpable, but there was something powerful in the way the neighborhood was beginning to change. People started to realize that standing up wasn't just about individual fights. It was about creating a culture of accountability where everyone's voice mattered and no one had to live in fear. For Valentina, the healing process was slow but steady. The physical wounds had healed, but the emotional scars would take longer. Amina knew that Valentina would always carry the memory of the incident, of the pain, of the terror that had come from someone who was supposed to be a neighbor. But as the days passed, Valentina's confidence grew. She began to sit outside again, her smile returning, though Amina could tell it wasn't quite the same. It would take time for her daughter to fully trust the world again, but they had made it through, and that was enough, for now. Amina's thoughts often drifted to Karen, the woman who had been the source of so much pain and fear. She had been expelled from the HOA, but Amina knew that Karen wouldn't just disappear. The woman had too much pride, too much anger. But Amina didn't fear her anymore. Karen's power had been broken, and Amina had no intention of allowing her to regain it. In a way, Karen's defeat had been Amina's greatest triumph. It was a reminder that no matter how small you feel, your voice can still echo, can still make a difference. Even in the darkest moments, even when the odds seemed impossible, Amina had found the courage to stand up, to speak the truth, and to demand justice for herself and her daughter. As Amina sat on the porch one evening, watching Valentina play in the yard, she realized something profound. This fight, this journey had not only changed her, it had changed the way she saw the world. She was no longer someone who would quietly accept injustice. She was someone who would fight back, someone who would never let fear silence her again. And she knew, without a doubt, that she would continue to speak up for the voiceless, to challenge the systems that allowed cruelty and corruption to thrive, and to protect the people she loved. The journey had been long, and there were still challenges ahead. The scars from the fight would always be there, both physical and emotional. But Amina had come out stronger on the other side, and as she watched her daughter play, her heart filled with hope for the future. The world had tried to break them, but in the end, it had only made them stronger. And in that moment, Amina understood that this was the true victory. Not the defeat of Karen, not the expulsion from the HOA, but the realization that she had created a life for Valentina, a life where she would always be able to stand tall, no matter what. If you've been moved by Valentina and Amina's story and want to see more real-life stories of justice, resilience, and fighting back against corruption, make sure to subscribe to HOA Denied Access. Don't miss out on our future content. Hit the notification bell and stay updated as we continue to uncover the truth and give a voice to those who need it most. Join the movement for a fairer, stronger community.